Hi, and welcome to Viewmaster Travels, where we visit the locations from vintage Viewmaster reels and try to learn some history about the place along the way. Today, it's reel 221, Los Angeles, California. LA is the second biggest city in the U.S. It was founded way back in 1781 by the Spanish and incorporated into the U.S. in 1850. Oil was discovered in the city in 1892, and LA soon accounted for 1/4 of the world's petroleum output. After World War I, the population boomed, tripling by 1940. These Viewmaster pictures were taken in 1942, the golden age of LA, before the freeways and before Disneyland. This was the LA of classic film noir detective movies, when people still worked and lived in a vibrant and exciting city that seemed full of opportunity and glamour. For this trip, I found a couple visitor guides from the time. One lists things to see, and the other's a map of attractions. We'll use these as we go. There's 7 pictures on the Viewmaster reel we had to find. Here was our first target. Pershing Square. Pershing Square is marked on the map we had. It's right in the middle of downtown. And the building in the picture is the landmark Biltmore Hotel. So we drove downtown and checked into the Biltmore. The Biltmore opened in 1923, and it was the largest hotel west of Chicago at the time, really putting LA on the map as a tourist destination. It hosted most of LA's important events, from the Oscars to big bands. It even hosted Germany's Graf Zeppelin on its way around the world in 1929. In 1939, it was at the Biltmore that Walt Disney received a special Academy Award for Snow White, an Oscar and 7 dwarf Oscars. And in 1947, just a little after the Viewmaster pictures were taken, it was the last place Elizabeth Short was seen before being found murdered nearby. Eventually known as the Black Dahlia, her gruesome murder is one of the most infamous unsolved crimes in Los Angeles history. Today, the inside is amazing. It really sends you back in time to LA's golden age, hanging out in the lobby, watching people come and go, and soaking in the history. Across the street is Pershing Square, a small park the size of one city block. The area is pleasant, but kind of a mishmash of styles. There's a dog park, some modern art, some historic art, and some wooded areas. Turns out it's been a public park since 1866 and has gone through several name changes over the years. This memorial to soldiers who died in the Spanish-American War is the oldest work of public art in LA from the year 1900. And this cannon is from the USS Constitution, put here in 1935. It's a nice space, and it made a good starting point for our exploration of the city. So we left the square and headed up Hill Street towards our next destination. After walking about a block, though, we came across this, Angel's Flight. This was really unexpected. It's a funicular railway that goes from Hill Street up to the plaza that's above Olive Street. And in this vintage brochure, it was somebody's #1 thing they wanted to see on their visit. We hopped in, paid our $1, and rode to the top and took a look around. Angel's Flight was originally built in 1901, a little further up the road on the corner. It originally took people up to the Bunker Hill neighborhood, which is a block northwest, but on quite a big hill. Bunker Hill was a really upper-class neighborhood in the early 1900s, and the people who lived there used Angel's Flight to get up and down the hillside. However, by the 40s, the wealthy had moved to the suburbs because the metro and new freeway system let them live further away from downtown, and Bunker Hill was considered a slum. By the mid-60s, the entire Victorian neighborhood was demolished, the hill was leveled, and modern skyscrapers began to be built instead. Angel's Flight was dismantled in 1969 and stored for 27 years until it was rebuilt in its current location. It was a fun ride up to the top, and it's a fascinating part of LA's history, but there's not much to see at the top, so we rode back down again and kept walking along Hill Street to City Hall. LA City Hall was completed in 1928, and when the Viewmaster pictures were taken, it would have been a major landmark of the city, enough of a landmark that it was famously destroyed in the 1953 movie version of War of the Worlds. The brochure says it's the tallest building in Southern California, which it was until 1964. There's an observation deck at the top, and we'd hoped to get some great views of the city, but the entire building was closed to the public due to COVID. So we kept going along Main Street toward the 101 freeway. What interested me so much about the Viewmaster pictures is that they were from before the freeways dissected the city. You can see on this map, dated 1950, that the 101 freeway ends when it reaches Hollywood in the north, and you'd have to drive city streets across town. When the freeways were built in the city, entire streets and neighborhoods were removed, kind of like what happened to Bunker Hill. We crossed the bridge over the 101 and found Alvarez Street, a bit of old Mexico. What an odd time capsule this area turned out to be. This plaza and claustrophobic Mexican-themed open-air shopping mall is on the site of the original city center from the 1820s, when California was part of Mexico. In fact, the building in the background is the Avila Adobe, built in 1818, and it's the oldest standing residence in Los Angeles. You can take a quick tour of the Adobe, and it really feels like you're going back in time. However, Alvarez Street, as it was in the 40s and as it still is now, was actually created in 1930, specifically as a tourist attraction. It was created as part of a plan by Christine Sterling and Harry Chandler to save the Adobe building, and they knew that creating a themed open-air shopping mall in Los Angeles would help ensure the Adobe's survival. Their plan was very successful. The street is listed as a key thing to do in my brochure, and today it enjoys millions of visitors a year, even if it's not entirely authentic. And now, most of the buildings there are over 100 years old, preserving perhaps not an authentic Mexican history, but that of Los Angeles itself. Right across the street from the Mexican market was our next destination. Union Station. Opened in 1939, Union Station is still the main railway station in Los Angeles. It consolidates all the major rail services as well as the local metro and bus lines. In what seems to be LA fashion, though, the city's original Chinatown was demolished to make way for Union Station, and this was partly due to the efforts underway to preserve Alvarez Street and the plaza a block to the west, which had been the intended location for the train station. Ironically, the entire area was built on top of a Native American Tongva village named Yanga that survived until the mid-1800s. Archaeological remains of the village were discovered as Union Station was built. The station is very attractive inside, and we recognized it from several movies that had used it as a filming location, like Blade Runner and The Dark Knight Rises. And our next couple stops were a bit further than we were willing to walk, so it seemed appropriate to try out the LA metro system. At the time, we really thought LA didn't have any public transit rail system. It once had the world's largest metro system, but it had all been removed in the late 50s. However, the first line of the modern metro system, the Blue Line, opened in 1990, and now there's over 100 miles of track you can ride. So we took the Red Line to MacArthur Park. This park was originally named Westlake Park, and it's a lake west of downtown. The same year the Viewmaster pictures were taken originally, the newspaper magnate William Randolph Hearst got the park's name changed to MacArthur because Hearst wanted Douglas MacArthur to become the next U.S. president. Most Angelenos were pretty upset by the name change. Interestingly, at the time there was also an Eastlake Park. Eastlake and Westlake were the drinking water reservoirs for Los Angeles in the early 1900s. In fact, the original aqueduct ran directly to the Alvarez Street market, since that was the center of town at the time. Eastlake Park is now named Lincoln Park. When we arrived at MacArthur Park, though, we found it entirely fenced off. Apparently, it was closed for refurbishment, although that seemed mainly to get the homeless population living there to move somewhere else. Since we couldn't get into the park, we couldn't match the picture exactly, but comparing the images as best we can, you can see the boat rental building is gone, and there's a few more buildings in the background now, but otherwise it's still very similar. Since we couldn't go in the park, we went back to the station and made our way to Rose Gardens, Exposition Park. Exposition Park is a large complex of museums and attractions at the very southern end of Los Angeles. It's an enormous complex with natural history, science, and cultural museums, as well as several sports stadiums. It's hosted 2 Olympics in 1932 and 1984. Originally, in the late 1800s, the site was an agricultural fairground, I think kind of a giant farmer's market. The fairground contained a large racetrack, which raced anything, horses, dogs, even camels. But in 1921 it was replaced with a garden, which became a rose garden in 1927, and it quickly became one of the most popular and largest in the world. The building in the background is the Natural History Museum, which opened in 1913, and it contains specimens from the La Brea tar pits, as well as archaeological artifacts from the native Tongva people, and also from the original Chinatown that Union Station replaced. The Science Museum that's there has the original Space Shuttle Endeavour, one of the 4 remaining space shuttles, and it's really worth seeing. The Rose Garden itself has a large fountain in the center, lots of benches and statues, and hundreds of varieties of roses to view. But as much as it's a very pleasant place to be, especially in the Southern Californian climate, we had one more destination to find. Wee Kirk o' the Heather. This location was unlike the rest, and it took a little research to find. It's a church in the Forest Lawn Cemetery that isn't even in Los Angeles, it's in Glendale to the north. We wondered why the Los Angeles Viewmaster reel would include something this far out of town, but the cemetery is heavily featured in the visitors' brochures of the time and was really being marketed as a tourist destination, so I guess it made sense to include it. Forest Lawn Cemetery was established in 1906 and emphasized serenity and beauty over traditional graveyard features. The Wee Kirk o' the Heather is a small church within the cemetery, and it's a copy of a Scottish church that was built in the parish of Glencairn, Scotland in the year 1310. The church in Forest Lawn was built in 1929. It's a very nice, quaint church. Its stained glass windows all represent scenes from one of Scotland's most famous love songs, Annie Laurie, based on a real person who likely attended the original church in Scotland in the 1700s. The wishing chair outside includes stones from the original Scottish church, and there's a small museum inside with other artifacts. And in the Viewmaster picture, the tower on the hill behind the church is now gone. It was a very artfully disguised water tower on the hill named Tower of Legends. That tower was demolished in 1948, so we went up the hill to see what was there now. At the top of the hill, we found what seemed to be a large cathedral, but in fact, it's an entire building created to house just one gigantic panoramic painting. The painting is named The Crucifixion by Jan Stejka, painted in Poland between 1894 and 1900. It took 6 years to create, and that's because it's 195 feet wide and 45 feet high. In 1904, Stejka attempted to display the painting at the St. Louis World's Fair, but their display halls weren't big enough to house it. And then the painting was confiscated by the U.S. Customs Department because Stejka couldn't afford the fees to ship it home. It was lost for 40 years, until the founder of Forest Lawn Cemetery found it in the basement of the Chicago Opera House wrapped around a telephone pole, and he brought it to California. It's now housed in an enormous 500-seat auditorium. An hourly presentation reveals the painting suddenly from complete darkness and then describes many of its details. It's astonishing, and we wouldn't have stumbled on it if we weren't chasing down these Viewmasters. Forest Lawn was the last location we were after, but there was one more interesting thing we found. We stopped for lunch near the Forest Lawn Cemetery at what was apparently Walt Disney's favorite restaurant, Tam O'Shanter's, one of LA's oldest restaurants. The name of the restaurant is based on Scottish poet Robert Burns' poem of the same name, and it's also the name of a restaurant in Ayr, Scotland, where the poem was actually set. When Burns wrote Tam O'Shanter, he lived in Glencairn Parish, just 20 minutes away from the original Wee Kirk o' the Heather church. What an interesting coincidence. Following the trail of these Viewmaster pictures turned into a great walking tour of the city, and we found modern downtown LA to be a lot more welcoming than we'd expected. The city is bursting with history and fascinating details are everywhere. There's a lot we didn't get to see, and we're looking forward to visiting again. That's it for this episode. See you next time.